Hey everybody, it's Politics by Jake, and this is the Memorial Day edition. We've got quite a bit to go here, so without further ado, let's get right into it. So we're going to do a unit or a segment here, and we're going to talk about Ukraine, and we're going to talk about what I think are some little-known aspects of the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. So allow me to extemporaneously just expand on that a little bit. And once again, what I really want to talk about, or what we're really going to talk about here, is the philosophical underpinning of Putin and Russia's viewpoint, and there is one, other than that Ukraine is full of Nazis and they're a danger to Mother Russia, just like Hitler, and Putin is getting rid of them. You know, with the Russians, don't expect anything very complicated. It's kind of slapdash. It's kind of intellectually sloppy. But this is basically what it is. But there's more to it. And the more to it, the part where Ukraine is filled with Nazis and they're going to attack Mother Russia, which is really, you know, when you think about it, simple arguments are the best arguments. Simple solutions are the best solutions. And for Putin to spread this lie, and it is a lie, and it is a big lie, a la Hitler, who is reported to have said famously, or infamously as the case may be, is reported to have said to his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, lies, lies, tell them lies. The bigger, the better. Sooner or later, something is bound to stick. And this is a Hitlerian big lie that Putin is talking about when he says that Ukraine is full of Nazis, and he, you know, the Second World War, as you can imagine, tremendously traumatic to the Russian people. They have a long-standing memory of it. 30 million dead, probably many more who were maimed, and there were casualties of various sorts. And so this is just absolutely positively profound. And probably one of the best things that Putin could do to get the populace on his side, since there's no free press there, there's no free media, no Western media is allowed in, is to say that the Nazis are coming again. And this would get people on his side. And so basically, that's what he does. But the invasion of Ukraine, which I just described to you, the kind of slapdash and shoddy, all too simplistic underpinnings for it, is really just part of it. And now the thing I'm going to talk to you about for a minute are things that people generally don't know about Russia and its history. And it goes back hundreds of years. So it's a long time, which for these elements that have kind of stuck, and as a consequence, they are stuck in the Russian mentality. The West does not generally know about these things, but the Russians absolutely do, and it's all tied up with their religion. And if you understand this, if you know about this, it makes it easier to understand what Putin is doing. Not that it's right, and you say, oh, Comrade Putin, we understand now. We understand why you're doing this. All is good. All is good. All is forgiven. No, that's not it. But it makes it easier to understand why Russia has some of the attitudes that it does about this. And it's, you know, honestly, I'm telling you, it's really kind of freaky. So with that in mind, here we go. Now, in many ways, it can be said that Russia is a state right now in search of an ideology. For the decades that Russia was controlled by the ideology of communism, you know, by the Soviet Union, there really wasn't so much of a problem with this. But with the breakup of the Soviet Union came of necessity a repudiation of the communism and the philosophical tenets of communism and its dialectic, with really nothing from an ideological standpoint to replace it. And to make a long story short, what would eventually replace it was an idea called Eurasianism, which is proposed by one of the great fathers of the idea of Eurasianism, is a guy named Alexander Dugin. Among other things, some of the aspects of Eurasianism can be stated as followed. And as I said, once again, if you're looking for profound and deep philosophical concepts here, sorry, you're going to be disappointed. This ain't it. But that said, here we go. Number one, the United States is an empire of lies. Hey, I told you it was going to be like this. Now, obviously, this this probably does not come as a great surprise to know that the Russians think that the United States is evil, the United States is putrid, and we'll go into the word putrid later because it's from the Russian point of view. It applies. It shouldn't come as any surprise, but that's what it is. That's number one, okay? That's number one of the great doctrine of Eurasianism. Number two is a little more ominous, and they get more ominous from this point on. Russia, this is number two. Russia is a distinct civilization that should forge a continent-spanning state along the lines of its former empire before it was the Soviet Union. Before communism took over, the arching philosophy of that state and of Russia as a part of this should retake the old parts of its empire, but without communism as a social, economic, and governmental philosophy. Okay? Now that gets more ominous because you've heard me say before that Putin will, number one, he's not going to stop doing what he's doing. We're going to get that to in a minute. That's actually like point number 4 or point number 5. And that he's not going to stop with Ukraine. He's going to go all the way to Paris, just like Peter the Great, just like Stalin wanted to do, and it's just not going to stop. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I just wanted to say that. Okay, number 3, the retaking of the old Russian Empire, even the old Soviet satellites, and it's going to be more than that. Like I said, it's going to go right to the English Channel. This is number 3. It's a civilizational challenge to the West, and the West cannot ignore it, and they will not ignore it. And I mean, I think you've seen that that's pretty much correct. I think it's correct that we can't ignore that. Therefore, if Russia, and this is point number 4, or depending on how you're looking at point number 5, if Russia is going to embark upon this, it must see it through. There are no half measures. So in other words, what you have here is an attempted empire. And there are really very good reasons, other than the obvious, why we should really very much pay attention to this. Now, what comes of the concept of the Putrid West? And I know these things come as no surprise. It's not a great shock. It's not rocket science. Not a great stretch of the imagination to understand that Russia thinks that the West is putrid. But this approach has sometimes been referred to as and I hate to honor it with a phrase like this, but the Russian method. And it's just, to me, the traditional sloppy Slavophile approach that they try to foment wherever they can, for the maximum amount of strife and contention in the United States or, really any other country, honestly, of the fact that the West is putrid. That's a doctrine. The West is putrid. And the funny thing about this is that Russia's leaders, this is such a self-serving doctrine. I mean, it's just strictly for local consumption because Russia's leaders love the West. They decry it as decadent, but they love it. They keep their money in Western banks. When they retire to places in the West, in Western Europe or in the United States if they can. They send their children, you've heard me talk about all this before, they send their children to Western schools if they can. They send them, if they can, they send them to schools in the United States. They vacation in the West. So this approach of the West being putrid is really strictly for the benefit of themselves and the people they lead, because they themselves just don't believe it, as I have just observed. The next concept is of Russia as the third Rome. Now, this is really spooky, quite interesting. This is an apocalyptic doctrine that the Russians hold, and it is of long standing. And what it means is that Russia basically is destined to rule the world. Yes, basically what happened is this. When the Eastern Roman Empire, which some people like to call Byzantine, I don't like that at all. Really, it's the Roman Empire. There were two parts of the Roman Empire, two heads. There was the western part that kind of fell, in 456 AD, which you can say, you can pick, AD means Anno Domini for those who are kind of Christian religion oriented. It also could be called 456 CE, which means Common Era. Take your pick. You may hear me say either one, but that's what it means. 456 CE, 456 AD. But really, like I said, it's not Byzantine. It's the Roman Empire, the western half of the Roman Empire. It had been divided centuries before, about in the time of Constantine. It was divided into two parts, and it fell. It went on a lot longer. It basically went on another 1,000 years. Rome fell the Western Empire fell in AD or CE 456. And the Eastern Roman Empire fell in 1453. So that's like almost another 1,000 years that it lasted. And it fell to the Ottoman Turks, and they established a caliphate. This is one of the reasons why in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, it talks about, and Lawrence of Arabia was very important in the defeat of the Turkish Empire, because the Turkish Empire had been around since 1453, and it destroyed the caliphate. And this gets into Ataturk and the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's stuff that we've actually talked about. But see, this stuff is all connected. We've talked about this before. And the caliphate is basically a political entity of Islam. So obviously, when this Eastern Roman Empire fell, which had been around for just a tremendous amount of time, if you include the Western Empire, it's in excess of 2,000 years that the Roman Empire had been around. So obviously, this left a power vacuum. And there was a lot of talk at the time amongst people about this. People were very concerned. And as I say, the time would be 1453 to 1500, with the caliphate taking over, about who's going to stand up to the Turkish Empire. And so by the end of the 15th century, as I just said, the idea had gradually emerged that Moscow was actually in the exalted position of being the third Rome, and that the Tsar of the Rus, or the Ross, and that means red. Rus, Ross, that means red. Those the Russians. The Rus are the Russians. If you hear someone say the Ross, that's the Russians. So that the Tsar of the Russians would be the new Basileus. And the word Basileus is the name given to the Eastern Roman Empire. It's a Greek word, and it means the same as the Western Roman word imperator. And imperator means emperor. So Basileus and imperator, they mean the very same thing. Who would be the new emperor? And there were several people who put forward this idea of Moscow as the third Rome. But the most dramatic expression of it was a series of letters that were written to the Russian Tsar, who at that time was Basil III, by a monk named Philotheus, who said, and I'm quoting, "So know, O pious king, that all the Christian kingdoms," this is pretty intense, "all the Christian kingdoms came to an end and came together in a single kingdom of yours." And then he says some other things, but then he says, "Two Romes have fallen. The third stands, and there will be no fourth. No one shall replace your Christian tsardom." And the word tsar is just a Temetic, and a Temetic means just like dropping some letters out of the word. A Temetic recreation of the word Caesar. So Tsar to the Russians means the same thing as Caesar. In German, Kaiser is the German word that means Caesar. So we see the long-standing influence of Rome in the world as it was right up to just very almost to the present, within 100 years of the present anyway. So no one will replace your Christian tsardom. And, this is interesting stuff, right? So the first Rome, just to orient ourselves here, the first Rome was in Italy. It was the city of Rome. That's where it was. Rome was in Italy. That was the first one. And the second Rome, of course, that was Constantinople. which was named after the Emperor Constantine, who basically founded it. I mean, it was there before, but it was taken over. What was there before was basically absorbed by the Roman Empire, and it was named for the emperor at that time, who was Constantine. And Moscow was supposed to be the third one. Now, among other things, this is kind of spooky. I think it's spooky because it's an apocalyptic and nation-centric viewpoint or egocentric viewpoint. And it means that, among other things, Putin is a Roman emperor. And that's kind of how they look at him. So it's a kind of apocalyptic viewpoint, as I said, of the destiny of Russia. And as like I said, it's entirely self-serving. I mean, this is gross. This is gross to find out about this and know this. But this is an unfortunate fact. And it's a strong underlayment in the worldview of both Stalin and Putin. And Putin, of course, has a number of Russian Orthodox priests surrounding him. And those priests, historically speaking, are bearers of that concept that Moscow is the third Rome. And they told Stalin this, and they tell Putin this, and he knows it. That is what is behind this to a great degree. And so if you want something that's going to keep you up at night and give you nightmares, that might be one of the things that would do it. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business or who have just started a business or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that you wanted asset protection. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created. And you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me, that's JAKELAW.me, and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing. And then set up a time where we can have a phone conference or call me directly now at 573-454-1168. That's 573-454-1168. Call now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. Now, the premise of this segment, this next segment or unit, as I sometimes call it, is that what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is basically, actually, in reality, the lead up to a prospective World War III, which we don't want to happen, of course. But that is what it looks like. And this is a radical statement, to be sure, that I sometimes unapologetically make, and it's something I stand by. So I'm going to show you a couple of things right now, because I'm not entirely alone in this view, apparently. First, let me talk about Tim Snyder and a recent post he made. It was actually him talking for the Kiev Post. And he said this, and he was responding to what somebody said. He said, "You said we were about to be a 1939. I'm going to agree with you in a certain way. My comparison would be 1938. This is 1938. This is the 1938 where Czechoslovakia has chosen to fight. Czechoslovakia has chosen to fight, so you have, in other words, an imperfect democracy. It's the furthest democracy east in Eastern Europe. It's not perfect. It has various problems. This is the hypothetical he's talking about now, by the way. But when threatened by a larger neighbor, it chooses to resist. And in that world where Czechoslovakia resists, and that is to say, and I'm interpolating here, that hypothetical alternate reality 1938, where Czechoslovakia resists, there's no Second World War. And he says the Czechs had a good army. So just to give you a little bit of background on this, in 1938, Czechoslovakia was one of Hitler's demand. If Europe were in the real world, he first occupied a part of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland, which was the southern part. And this really weakened the Czechs because a lot of their military border fortifications were there. And the reason Hitler did this was economic, very much like Poland, by the way. this, by the way, is a concept of economics called primitive accumulation, and it is where a stronger country takes over a weaker country for economic reasons. In Poland, for example, they needed their coal, but they also needed their steel and other things as well. Primitive accumulation is almost always violent and barbaric. There's nothing free market or controlled about it. It's survival of the strongest. And in the real world of 1938, the great powers let this happen. The great powers, just like they let him march into the Rhineland, just like they let Hitler do everything else that he did, they let it happen. Why? Because they wanted to appease Hitler. Basically, this was Hitler's posture most of the time. He would say, we need such and such for such and such reason, and he's talking about a land, But after we get it, we will have no more demands. Germany wants peace, etc., blah, 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 yada, 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 and so on. And Czechoslovakia was one of those demands. But what Snyder is saying is that if there's a world where the Czechs didn't allow this to happen, World War II would have been stopped. It never would have happened. And this is because, number one, the Czechs were a democracy. And number two, they had a strong army. They could fight. And so what Snyder is saying is that his situation in Ukraine is like a 1938, a hypothetical alternative reality 1938 where the Czechs fought. Otherwise, yes, this is 1939. And I'm totally okay with that. As I said at the beginning of this unit, we're in a situation where we're basically looking at the beginning of World War III. And there's just no question about it. So if Snyder wants to make this point, I'm totally okay with it. And it's actually, as I said, an alternative 1938 scenario. It's a legitimate point of view. I think he's right. And the West is not making the same mistake it made in 1938 when it left the Czechs twisting in the wind, so to speak. And this is about a doctrine that does this and allows this. And I want to talk to you about this more now. And the doctrine is appeasement. And appeasement is basically when you give an aggressor what they want so they don't hurt you. Essentially, that's what it is. Now, the ancient Romans were against appeasement. Their response to situation was that if there was any trouble somewhere, they would basically send a legion to deal with it just like that. They did not fool around with it. Machiavelli knew this. He knew this to be true. He said there is no avoiding war. It can only be postponed to the benefit of others. War actually broke out in 1936. The Italian fascists and Hitler's Nazis in the Spanish Civil War. This was a chance for the parties to test out their weapons, test out their procedures, just like what's going on in Ukraine right now. And it didn't end. The Spanish Civil War didn't end until 1939, just a few months before the invasion of Poland by Hitler. And this is what we have today. And do we have to look at things this way now? Do we have to recognize the situation is that the 20th century precedent for a justification of this situation exists? This is a huge parallel with what's going on right now in Ukraine. And this is one reason why I say we're looking at the lead up to World War III, because it's the same thing that happened then. This is one thing I say at Politics by Jake all the time. You have to understand history. If you don't understand history, that it always repeats itself. Actually, interestingly, Machiavelli said that too. He said history always comes around again. And if you don't know what happened, when it comes around again, you won't recognize it for what it is, and you'll repeat the same mistakes. So this is going to be an issue, and it's a terrible ordeal. It can be defeated, but the solutions are there. And we have to pay attention. We have to get our mind right. We have to realize just what it is that we're involved in, not stick our head in the sand like the proverbial ostrich. For other reasons, we have Belarus, for example. That's a problem. They've amassed a lot of troops, the Russians have, in an attempt to open a northern front on the conflict. Nothing has happened there yet, but it's there and it's threatening. Similarly, though not at war, we have Moldova, whose government is or was pro-Western and is basically recently quit because they are being asymmetrically attacked by Russia, which is an entirely common tactic by Russia. A Russia that is continually provoking, continually seeking weaknesses, continually probing, seeking advantages, and relatively unrelenting. This is their modus operandi. They are always doing this. Now, of course, Russia is an example of a closed society. Of course, nothing that Putin doesn't approve of gets out into the media at the best of times, and certainly not now. This should be a lesson to all about the dangers of nations who do not allow freedom of expression, like mainland China, other than the official government line. You have many in the populace, of course, who are cowed naturally, and I'm talking about the Russian populace, I'm talking about the Chinese populace, because they see that arrests are being made. People are being disappeared for speaking out while the government styles the conflict, which it itself started in terms of World War II, based on the false idea that the Ukrainians, and this is extraordinary, but this is what it is, that the Ukrainians are somehow all Nazis, and that Russia is simply redefending itself from Nazis in the same way as was done in World War II. And China is much the same way. We have to look at the alliance between Russia and China as solid. It's really there, no matter what anybody says or what people may say. So much so, in fact, that for the first time in 30 years, the United States is moving back into the Philippines. It's reestablishing its military presence there because mainland China has aggressively and in violation of international law and treaty been attempting to co-opt almost the entire South China Sea, which MacArthur formerly styled as a peaceful lake. So Politics by Jake says a resounding no to appeasement. It's my intention to call out any such appeasers in our government, such as MAGA Mike Johnson and all the other knuckleheads and morons who delayed the aid package that basically everybody agreed on a half year previously. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back. And what I want to talk to you about now is something I call virtual invisibility. No, not literal comic book type invisibility. What I am talking about is a practical invisibility, a kind of invisibility where you cannot be seen, where your personal transactions are shielded, where your business affairs are hidden from prying eyes, where a purchase of certain items is far less likely to be able to be found out by persons who have an intent to do you and your loved ones harm, the kind that results in the preservation and the protection of your personal assets, your business assets, all for your benefit and the benefit of your loved ones, the ones you are doing all this for in the first place. That's virtual invisibility. Crazy, you say? No, this exists. It's a thing. Want to know more? Contact me either at my website, www.jakelaw.me, or call me direct at 573-454-1168. Do it now. Become invisible now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. So we've been talking about appeasement, and we're going to talk some more about that. And you'll recall that I talked about Machiavelli, and he made famously the statement that, quote, "There is no avoiding war. It can only be postponed, and to the advantage of your enemy." And so we have the idea that appeasement does not solve the problem of war. It only delays it, and also it assures that when war comes, it will be a situation where the condition is more favorable to your adversary. Now, we are about a couple of years into what some like to call the conflict in Ukraine, quote unquote. But this is a war. It's my contention that this is the beginning of World War III, if we're not careful. And ever since this war started, because it is a war, and it is a war, by the way, of extermination that the Russians are intent on wiping out and eradicating the Ukrainian culture. And this can be shown by the tremendous amount of attacks upon civilians and civilian infrastructure, whereas Ukraine generally is attacking military infrastructure. But ever since the war started, there have been a group of people, and they've been calling upon the United States and Ukraine and NATO to engage in negotiation as a solution. And they have various plans allowing Russia to take the land which it has invaded by force in violation of the Budapest Memorandum, 1993, which absolutely positively guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine in return for giving up its nuclear weapons, which it did. And this is just an entirely typical thing that the Russians do, and we're going to talk more about what the Russians do. So There just can't be any question. And, honestly, there's so much that they do that I don't have time in the show to gather all the sources and tell you about all the things that they do, but I am going to tell you about some of them. So if you couldn't tell by now, I am absolutely, positively against such a thing. And I am much more of the opinion that Russia's aggression and their attempt to spread their power over all the world must be met at its earliest opportunity. And speaking for Politics by Jake, I can say that we here support the actions of the NATO member nations and the United States and aiding the Ukrainians and defending their sovereign lands and nation. Now, there are those who say, and among them there are certainly those in the halls of Congress, who say that we shouldn't be spending all this money to aid Ukraine. And when I say the halls of Congress, I'm basically talking about Speaker Mike Johnson. I'm talking about the MAGA caucus, both in the House and in the Senate, who say that we shouldn't be spending all this money to aid Ukraine when we have uses for the money here in the United States for our own people. And again, I say in response to this is not only short-sighted, but it is a dangerous point of view. And I would also counter it by saying that the money that is being spent to help Ukraine defend itself is being done in consideration, among other things, for the defense of the United States and also for the defense of, Western Europe, with whom we have treaty obligations, and that it is much better to support the Ukrainians and their attempts to repel the Russian invasion rather than to have to deal with the Russians later in some other place, which, as I'm going to point out in a moment, we absolutely, positively will have to. There's just no question about this. And I like very much, and I prefer to the statements of the appeasers in our media and in our halls of government, the idea that was expressed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt that, quote, we in the Americas will decide for ourselves whether and when and where our American interests are attacked or our security is threatened. This, by the way, is from a fireside chat on May 27th in 1941. I'm about to quote several things from it. He went out to point the absolute ridiculousness of these notables who I have generally, and, honestly, all too tactfully, I think, called appeasers when he said, I have said on many occasions that the United States is mustering its men and its resources only for purposes of defense, only to repel attack. But we must be realistic when we use the word attack. We have to relate it to the lightning speed of modern warfare, which is, interesting considering that warfare has become far more apropos to the word lightning than it was in 1941. Nevertheless, some people, he says, seem to think that we are not attacked until bombs actually drops in the streets of New York or San Francisco or New Orleans or Chicago. But they are simply shutting their eyes to the lesson that we must learn from the fate of every nation that the Nazis have conquered. And we're going to liken this to Russia in a minute. The attack on Czechoslovakia, which I talked about previously in the show, began with the conquest of Austria. The attack on, that was called the Anschluss, by the way, that's a German word. The attack on Norway began with the occupation of Denmark. The attack on Greece began with the occupation of Albania and Bulgaria. The attack on the Suez Canal began with the invasion of the Balkans and North Africa. And the attack on the United States can begin with the domination of any base which menaces our security, be it north or be it south. Nobody can foretell tonight just when the acts of the dictators, and Xi is a dictator, president for life. Putin is a dictator. And not only that, as I've talked to you about before, the doctrine, the religion of Russia basically states that Moscow is the third Rome. And by derivation, if Moscow is the third Rome, then Putin is the emperor of Rome. But, he goes on to say, we know enough by now to realize that it would be suicide to wait until they are in our front yard. When your enemy comes at you, he says, in a tank, and he uses a quaint phrase here, he calls it a bombing plane. He says, when your enemy comes at you in a tank or a bombing plane, if you hold your fire until you see the whites of his eyes, you will never know what hit you. Our Bunker Hill of tomorrow may be several thousand miles from Boston. Anyone with an atlas, he goes on to say, anyone with a reasonable knowledge of the sudden striking force of modern war knows that it is stupid to wait until a probable enemy has gained a foothold from which to attack. Old-fashioned common sense calls for the use of strategy that will prevent such an enemy from gaining a foothold in the first place, close quote. And at this point in time, let me just observe the quaint language. I talked about bombing plane. He talks about anyone with an atlas. This was long in advance of the internet. Atlases and encyclopedias used to be what passed for the internet, where you could find out all sorts of information. All right, he further observes that, quote, every dollar of material that we send helps to keep the dictators away for our own hemisphere. This is particularly poignant on such holidays as July 4th and Memorial Day, which basically celebrate our independence and the importance of the sacrifices of our veterans, of our soldiery, of our military, and how important it is to not only sell those lives dear, but treat those lives dear. About the people I have perhaps too tactfully and mildly here called appeasers, FDR also spoke more strongly, saying those in the New World who were seeking profits, businessmen like Elon Musk, would be urging, but not only Elon Musk, but Elon Musk is one. It would be problematic, and I wouldn't propose to say that Politics by Jake is targeting only Elon Musk. Elon Musk is being targeted, but he's just one. There are, frankly, many who could be targeted with regard to this. So anyway, going back to what he said, quote, those in the New World who were seeking profits would be urging that all the dictatorships desired was peace. They would oppose toil and taxes for more American armament. They would fasten an economic stranglehold upon our several nations. Quislings would be found to subvert the governments in our republic. And once again, can we possibly see in this the working of globalists who want access to the admittedly large mainland China economy and the admittedly large Russian economy, and would be willing to sacrifice and to make statements like that and say that these plainly repressive dictatorships, because they were repressive even in those times, all they desired was peace. And, they don't allow Western media in. They don't allow opposing views. They jail and they kill their own people. They commit genocide against, for example, the Uyghurs, who are Muslims. They put them in re-education classes. But, all they want is peace. So this is what he was talking about. And this fireside chat is great because it speaks loudly and it speaks pointedly about the issues that we are revisiting today. And I would add a pertinent aside. Does this sound anything like the things we here in the United States have been experiencing since the rise of Donald Trump and his gang, his MAGA gang, his MAGA fascist gang? Does this remind you of anybody in our halls of Congress, like Senator Hawley, who came out of the building in the middle of the demonstrators, or they were in the distance, and raised a fascist closed fist salute supporting them? This is fascism. This is the support of violence fused with reactionary ideas. Does this remind you of anybody in our halls of Congress like this, who in the most outrageous and stunning fashion brazenly supported, and Hawley is not the only one, of course, the person who is the Speaker of the House is an election denier. He does not believe that Joe Biden was legally elected the President of the United States. And there's about 100 to 112, I would say, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it's about that stuff, in the House who are the very same things. So, getting back to what I was saying, does this remind you, again, I ask you, of anyone in our halls of Congress who in the most outrageous and stunning fashion brazenly supported the violent coup attempt to expand it legislatively? A murderous attempt, and it was murderous. A violent attempt, and it was violent, to overthrow the government of the United States by subverting the will of a people in a lawful election. And I ask you, does anyone doubt that they are still, protected as they are by the apparent laissez-faire attitude within those halls, continuing to plot yet another coup attempt by using the organs of government to gain the situation to their favor? And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business, or who have just started a business, or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that you wanted asset protection. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth, and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created, and you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me, that's JAKELAW.me, and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing, and then set up a time where we can have a phone conference, or call me directly now at 573-454-1168. That's 573-454-1168. Call now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. Does anyone doubt that these same quote-unquote appeasers are in place in their various media organs? And, you know, I love Abraham Lincoln, and I actually know what he said, and I encourage everybody. There's a phrase in law. It's called getting right with Lincoln, because Lincoln was really one of the fathers of our country, and he did inaugurate what has been rightly called a new birth of freedom. We'll talk about this, of course, in other shows. You know, we're going to talk a lot about this. I talk a lot about this. But one of the things that I'm reminded of is Abraham Lincoln's expressed doctrine of pre-concert. And this is one of those things when you think to yourself, how do we know? How do we know who these people are? And this is a really good idea, because secret combinations operate in the dark. They don't like the light. Somebody said sunlight is the best disinfectant. Secret combinations hate the sunlight. They hate to have their acts have light shone upon them, so to speak. And Abraham Lincoln expressed this doctrine, as I say, of pre-concert. He called it the doctrine of pre-concert. And I think it's prescient, because this is a problem. Well, might you ask, well, how are we to know that what Jake is saying, for example, is true? It is a well-asked question. So Abraham Lincoln answered it in a speech, and he said, and it's actually from a speech called The House Divided. But this is part of it that people have not, mostly we hear the part that says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. But this is another part of it. And I'm quoting here, quote, we cannot absolutely know, facing the modern problem, we cannot absolutely know that all these exact adaptations are the result of pre-concert. But, and he likens it to a house, hence the concept, a house divided against itself. But when we see a lot of framed timbers, different portions of which we know have been gotten out at different times and places and by different workmen, and when we see these timbers joined together, again, the analogy of building a house, and see that they exactly make the frame of a house or a mill, all the tenons and mortises. And in the old days, they didn't necessarily use nails and screws. I mean, they did to a certain extent, but many houses were built using adaptations in the wood called tenons and mortises. And the tenon and the mortise, they would actually fit together. And it's really kind of ingenious way to create a house, and you didn't really need to use any nails to do it. You formed the sections of wood in a certain way so that they would fit together. And this is what he says. He said, and see that they exactly make the frame of a house or a mill. And you have to be exact. When you're using tenons and mortises, they have to go together exactly. If they go together, if they're a little bit off, it's not going to work. So it's fine work that has to be done. So he says all the tenons and mortises exactly fitting, and all the lengths and proportions, once again, incredibly required, of the different pieces exactly adapted to their respective places, and not a piece too many or too few, not omitting even scaffolding. And it's my point of view that it is most assuredly true, and this is me talking again, if Putin and his criminal gang are not stopped in Ukraine, they will not stop there. They will move further. They will move as far as they can move. Now, the reality of this situation is this: the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation can't be described as anything except a craven, a cowardly, and a dastardly attack. Just about ever since this attack, teams have been going in and collecting evidence of atrocities and war crimes committed by the Russian, of which there are so many, because they're attacking civilians. They're eradicating civilians. They're destroying everything, which include the killing of civilians, of course, but the destruction of all the towns. When the Russians go into a town, they destroy it. And when you look at it, at the end of it, it's completely destroyed and it's unlivable. So their strategy seems clearly to be to destroy civilian infrastructure, necessary things such as, means of production for heat, for electricity, destroying the houses and the apartments that the Ukrainians live in, all of which is creating a lot of hatred and a lot of sorrow and a lot of sadness for these people. And they've had to put up with this for these past couple of years. We in the United States and in Western Europe have not had to put up with this, but they have had to put up with us. Now, the people who want to talk about appeasement, I think maybe looking at the United States through the jaundiced eye of the far left and accusing the United States, which we hold no brief for, by the way, the far left, among other things I have called them the fratricide caucus, because they pretend they're Democrats, but really what they want to do is they want to knock off Democrats, and they will support Republicans in order to do it. So they accuse the United States of imperialism, such as was the common complaint of the left back in the 1960s, which you might say at that time was a more legitimate argument. But in answer to that, I would simply say, number one, this is not the same United States that exists now. But the facts of the matter are that the Russians and their various iterations, and here we go about me talking about comparing what's going on now to what the Nazis did, to what Nazi Germany did. Whether the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, their various iterations, that's what I mean by that, have regularly invaded and occupied their neighbors. In 1939, it was Latvia, it was Lithuania, it was Estonia, it was Poland. In 1938, it was Czechoslovakia. 1956, that was Hungary. 1940 was Romania, Eastern Germany in 1953, Georgia in 2008, Armenia in 1920, Afghanistan and Chechnya twice. And this is only a partial list. In my opinion, and this is something that's typically not thought of, I realize this is kind of not a wackadoodle opinion. I think it's a very supportable opinion. I'm not going to do more than state it now. There is grist for the mill that this is the way it was. The Russians, or the Soviets, in that iteration of the Russian Federation, were mere weeks away from invading Nazi Germany when Nazi Germany invaded them. And this is, one of the reasons why in countries that have had this happen to them, Latvia, Estonia, just to use two examples, they don't want the Russian back. And they oppose the Russians so much because life was so terrible under the Russians, and they remember this and they don't want it. People do not want what Russia is selling. And it's ridiculous, given this track record, to negotiate with the Russians or to think that the Russians want to negotiate. Now, recently, and this is part of the immense volume of disinformation and propaganda that comes out of Russia literally on the hour, like a tidal wave. Putin has said that he's going to suspend observance of the New START treaty, and this is actually, a while back. There's so much that comes out of these guys. It's just difficult to keep up. So this is just like one example, which is the last nuclear arm treaty that exists between the United States and Russia. And of course, one of the things that Russia wants to do, it wants to frighten the United States and NATO into that Russia is going to attack them with nuclear weapons. And this is simply part of that. And as a kind of aside, which has to do with appeasement as the larger topic, let me say that in my opinion, disarmament treaties are a prelude to war. They are things that you do when there is nothing else to do. But I would also observe, realistically speaking, how can you have disarmament in a situation like what we are seeing now in Ukraine? How can you disarm, for example, in the face of Alexander Dugin, who talked about the doctrine of Eurasianism? When, for example, in communist China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, that gang of predatory criminals, thugs, hooligans, they were never signatories to any treaty like this. And quite the opposite, they're clearly attempting to run wild outside of the treaty structure and disrupt the peaceful lake of the South China Sea, which resulted from the United States' defeat of Japan after World War II, for which we and our allies paid dearly. So besides this, the test ban treaty promoted by Kennedy, it's also up for grabs because the communist Chinese were never signatories to that either, and they have always refused to go along with that. Now, getting back to Ukraine and the general idea of appeasement, nobody, and this is our point of view, who has any sense of perspective can negotiate with anybody, not merely Putin, but anybody, when they're executing civilians, when they're bombing hospitals, when they're savaging and destroying schools, civilian apartments, and necessary infrastructure so that people can suffer rather than go after legitimate military targets, which is all too often what the Russian Federation does with regard to its conduct and its prosecution of its invasion of Ukraine. And accordingly, it's my opinion that in order for any negotiation to begin, there's absolutely, positively, just no question, but what Russia has to go back to its own borders, withdraw from all the territories that it's taken, go back to the 2012 or 2013 boundaries as a preliminary step for negotiation. And as I've talked about the fact that Putin really is not interested in negotiation. You heard me talk about the Dugin doctrine of Eurasianism, which I wouldn't attribute solely to Dugin, but he's a big proponent of it, as well as the idea of Moscow being the third Rome, and that if he thought he could, he would go all the way to Paris. But barring that, he certainly wants to take back the old Soviet satellites, and all these things being most certainly true and obvious, this is just not a person that you can negotiate with. You cannot negotiate with somebody who has this stance and these positions. You cannot negotiate with someone who's actively pursuing war and is committing mass atrocities and who has a history ever since 1999, when he was installed as president, of doing this continually. This is your appeasement. This is your proof. And there's been over 20 years of it. And it must stop. And of course, he is being stopped. But there are still these arguments by people saying, well, we should seek peace. And Putin says he wants peace. And Xi says he wants better relations. All they are doing is complaining that they complain about, for example, the international rules-based order. They're complaining because they can't do the things that they want, that they have to be circumscribed and be circumspect within these rules. And they're not, and they don't want to be. Now, finally, General Lucius Clay, to close this out, he was the commandant of Berlin in 1945, and he was also commandant of Berlin, it's interesting, in 1961. And he made a dire warning to President Kennedy about the Russians, and it was grave and it was stern in its import. And what he said to President Kennedy was this. He said that the Russians only understand force. They only respect power. And he told President Kennedy, you cannot negotiate with them except from a position of strength where they have the fear of you. And they are basically forced to negotiate because they know that you have the power to destroy them. This is the only way. And as an aside, I would make the observation that this idea is probably a throwback to the whole Byzantine power structure of the emperor concept that has been burned. And this is really true. I encourage you to check this out yourself. You'll find out what I'm saying is true. That has been burned into their collective consciousness or semi-consciousness or unconsciousness or whatever, what have you, ever since Constantinople fell in 1453 AD. So that's basically it on that. And I thought it was appropriate at this time, on this special time, for us to be talking about these things, because these things are our freedom. These are the things that we need to do to honor our fallen dead and to acknowledge the sacrifices and to sell our lives to these dictators and these emperors and these presidents for life as dearly as we can. And of course, the old saying, ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure. And with that, we're at the end of the Memorial Day edition, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I realize that you all have a lot of things planned out there. You're going to be going out, you're going to be doing barbecues, there may be Memorial Day parades, and you are going to be generally enjoying things. But I wanted to inject a note and some comments on the importance of remembering the sacrifices of our soldiery, of our military, the sacrifices of the collateral elements of industry and so on that are so necessary to the support of the military, and to realize that the threats to our freedom are very much existent today and that we need to be aware of them, we need to know them, we need to not appease them, but to address them. And with that, have a great time. We'll see you again on Friday. Bye-bye.